we move along through the book of Genesis, right? And we've entitled it Dawn. And as we move forward, we're actually going to see here in Genesis the dawn of a nation, right? And we mentioned last week that we'll see that God always, pretty much, if you look through the scriptures, God chooses one man. He always starts with one person that he can show himself sovereign, show himself powerful through. And if you think about yourself and you think, well, I'm just one person, what can I do? And that's true if you look at it in human terms, right? But there's a saying that says, you with God is a majority. Right? That's a truth. And God is always on the lookout for faithful persons, faithful people. Someone he can show himself strong and powerful through. Second Chronicles 16:9 says, the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. That's what the Lord wants for us. He's looking, right? And that's how it has been through the beginning of time. And that's exactly what we have here in Genesis. In fact, this man, because he surrendered to God and to his plan, God used him, as I said, to bring forth a nation. And I even said this last week. I believe, and of course we're talking about Abraham, right? We're talking about Abraham. I believe apart from Jesus Christ, there is not another person that has the most influence and that's most pivotal in man's history, in all of human history, than Abraham, right? In fact, Abraham in the Bible is called the father of the faith, and we're going to see why as we look through his life. But all three major monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and even Islam, they all claim Abraham as the father of their faith. Think about that, right? Christianity, Judaism, Islam. That's well over 4 billion people living today that would claim that. That's over 55% of the world's population would claim Abraham in one way or another, right? So, and that was just one man. Just one man has had that kind of impact on the world by surrendering to God. Now, Abraham wasn't a perfect man, and we're going to see that even in tonight's text. He was not a perfect man by any stretch, but he was a surrendered man. Now, tonight, hopefully, we're going to get through 3 chapters. A lot of narratives, so hopefully it'll move along as we go. But if you remember, last week we finished with chapter 11, and we finished with the genealogy of Shem, the righteous genealogy. And so open your Bibles, Genesis chapter 11. We're going to get to chapter 12 in just a second, but I want to refresh your memory. In verse 26 of chapter 11, it says this, now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And then verse 28 goes on and tells us that Abram's family was from Ur of the Chaldees. Now, Ur was not a small city. It's like a little podunk town or anything like that. It was quite a large city, and tradition would tell us that Ur was known for its paganism as well as its idolatry. And Ur was located in what would be called today modern-day Iraq, or Mesopotamia is another term for it. Now, there's traditions, and this is just a tradition because we have no real specific evidence on this, but traditions would tell us that Abram's family was somehow involved in idol making, the idol making business. If that's true or not, I'm not sure. But it's while in Ur that God speaks to Abram. So that's where we start, and that's where we begin in chapter 12, looking in verses 1 through 3. It says, now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, those few verses comprise what we call the Abrahamic covenant. God makes this covenant with Abraham, right? And when God talks about all the families of the earth, we see God blessing Abraham, and we see God, doing the things that he speaks to in this covenant. But ultimately, what God is speaking about it here is that through the lineage of Abraham, he was going to bring the Messiah. He's going to bring the Messiah. In fact, this covenant that God makes with Abraham really goes all the way back to the beginning of Genesis in chapter 3, verse 15. You remember back in the fall, after the fall of Adam and Eve, and God's given the passing the judgment on to Adam and Eve and into the serpent, and God basically speaks to the serpent, and he speaks of the seed of the woman, right? And the seed of the woman would eventually go on to crush the head of the serpent, and he would bruise his heel, right? And so God basically, at this moment with Abraham, he is now stepping into history, so to speak, right? He has a plan. He has a process that he's going to bring the Messiah through. And as someone once said, history is his story. So God's controlling it. God's sovereign in all of this. But he tells Abram to get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. Now, we teach and we talk about that Abram received the call while in Ur. And that's good, because Stephen even says that in Acts 7:2. He says, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. Kind of interesting, though, because we see actually previous chapter 11 in verse 31, it tells us that Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. In fact, they didn't leave there until after Terah had died, right? So you could say, well, is there a contradiction here? Did Abram receive the call while he was in Ur? Did he receive it while he was in, Haran? Now, Haran, they obviously named it after Lot's father, Terah's son, Haran. But they stayed there until Terah died. Now, of course, we know there's no contradictions with the Bible, right? It's the perfect word of God. So we can then surmise that Abram did hear God's call while in Ur, right? And now there was obviously something going on, either a God working sovereignly through his father Terah to providentially have his family start to move towards Canaan. Even though they didn't get there, they stopped halfway and they set up and made a town called Haran, right? But God was using that to move Abram along. I think that's pretty cool, right? Because oftentimes we point out that Abram, when God spoke to him, he got up and just left, right? That's real faith, right? But there was a process. See, you have to understand, with faith, there's always a process to following God, to that process of faith, right? And so God obviously was desiring to use Abram's father, Terah, to move him along in this process. Now, they didn't get all the way to Canaan, but now again, he's moving. So it's at this time while Abram's in Haran that God's like saying, okay, now it's time, Abram. It's time, as I told you back in Ur, it's time to move and continue on the process. Get all the way to Canaan to make that full move. Now, if God is speaking to us about something like that, like, oh, God's moving us in a way, like I take a huge leap of faith, we don't have to freak out, right? Because faith is a process. Yeah. We don't have to feel like, oh, I have to do this move right there. You can wait on the Lord. Listen, there's many more scriptures, in fact, vastly more scriptures about waiting on the Lord than there is to jump out and do something in a hurry. In fact, I've come to discover there's only two things that God tells us to hurry up and do and not wait. The first one is salvation. Now is the time. Today is the day of salvation, right? The second one is if you've got aught against your brother, and you leave your gift at the altar and go and make it right with your brother. Just pretty much everything else that comes along, it's about waiting upon the Lord. Waiting upon the Lord. They that wait upon the Lord, and so on. And so it's interesting that God, even with Abram, the father of faith, the one that stepped out and he left his family and so on. So there was still a process. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's good. It's very good. So God says to Abram, go, and I'm going to show you a land where you will go, right? And I'm going to make your name great. Now we know his name is great because over half the people in the world, and probably even beyond that, know who Abraham is. So he definitely made his name great. We know who Abraham is. And he says, I'm going to make you a great nation. And that's the power of God. Because think about it, only God could take one man and make him a nation. And not only a nation, but make him a great nation. Right? A great nation. In fact, God says to Israel in Exodus 19:6, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
Praise the Lord.
Right? That's what you're going to be. And it starts with Abraham. He made Israel that. But I love that because that should kind of resonate in our ears, right? A kingdom of priests and a holy nation, because that's exactly what God did with us, right? He took one man, Jesus Christ, and through Jesus Christ, 1 Peter 2:9 says, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. His own special people. I love that word special because that's peculiar. His own peculiar people. We're weird. Okay, we admit it. That you may proclaim, why did he do it? Proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So just like with Abraham, it was foreshadowed what Jesus would do. And then some, right? Then God says, I'm going to bless you. I will make your name great. I will bless you. Like I'll start to bless you. We're going to see how God blesses Abram. And then he says, in fact, I'll bless those who bless you. So it's not I will bless you, but when they bless you, I'll bless those who bless you. And then I will curse him who curses you. Again, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, again, this is prophetic. It's prophetic not just about Abram or Abraham, right, which he'll become. It's not just about his life. It's about the work that God is going to start with Abram and move out through his lineage, and it's going to come all the way down to the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And all the families of the earth through Jesus Christ shall be blessed through the Messiah. Now, Galatians 3:16 says, now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. And then Paul says, he does not say, and to seeds as of many, but as of one. And to your seed, he says, who is Christ. So this is the Abrahamic covenant, right? The Abrahamic covenant speaks directly to what God would do with Jesus Christ, bringing the Messiah through Abraham's lineage. Now, you'll see this covenant in different ways, in various forms and fashions, repeated throughout the rest of the book of Genesis. So God calls Abraham, and we see Abram's response. Verse 4, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran. And they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. So Abram is obedient to the call, right? He's obedient. And it's interesting, and we're going to see the ramifications of this, but verse 4 tells us that Lot went with him, right? It was his nephew. Lot went with him. And as we move along, you're going to see how that decision has a lot of ramifications, and not all good. Some consequences, right? We'll keep moving forward. Verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said To your descendants I will give you this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord and who had appeared to him. He moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel. He pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. So again, second time, at least that's been recorded for us, God appears to Abram. And it's interesting because God tells Abram, to your descendants, I will give this land, right? He hasn't really told him exactly. We'll see later. He's going to talk about the extent, but he's saying, I'm going to give you this land. So, okay, where I'm at right now, I guess that's what he's talking about. But God's speaking. He's going to open it up. He's going to give him more and more detail as we move along. And we're not going to see, though, what's interesting is we're not going to see this promise that God tells Abram, he's not going to see it, and even his descendants, until you get to Joshua, right? The book of Joshua, where they go into the land and they take the land and take possession of the land. So until that time, and even for the generations until Joshua, these people that are the children of Abraham and Abraham himself, they're all pilgrims and sojourners in the land, right? And yet, even though they didn't receive the promise, even though they didn't see the fulfillment of that, they stayed true to the promise. That's what we see in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. We call it the Hall of Faith, right? Because you see all these, especially the ones before Joshua, you see all of these men and women, the people that followed God, and they said they all were faithful, not having received the promise, right? They were faithful. That's Abraham, or Abram at this point. And so Abram was faithful. Now, he wasn't perfect. So as we move through the rest, as we continue on, we're going to see his first blunder, his first mess up. Verse 10, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. So please say, you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. Not maybe well with you, but it may be well with me. That was what Abram was worried about. First mistake, right? First mistake that Abram made is that God never told Abram to go down to Egypt. There was a famine, yes, but Abram needed to remind himself that I can trust in the Lord. This is the land that I'm supposed to be in. This is where I'm supposed to be. I can trust in God's provision. And Egypt, for the most part, is usually pretty much a symbol of the world. It's a symbol of the world. So for Abram, he was basically essentially trusting in the world. I'm going to go down, it's a famine. I'm going to go down to Egypt. They got food down there. I'm going to trust. They got food. They're going to take care of me, right? He was trusting in the world, not in the Lord. And he should have been in the land that God had told him to go, but he left. And so usually when you start off making one wrong choice, one bad decision, you start making other ones, right? You start making other ones, other bad decisions. And so again, here we have this whole situation where he's worried about, they're going to see, Sarai, she's beautiful, and, something's going to happen. So he tells her, tell him you're my sister. Now you're thinking, well, that's okay. That's a out and out lie. But actually, it wasn't quite a lie, because they were actually half brother and half sister. I know you're like, oh, that's kind of creepy. He explains in Genesis 20 verse 12, because he has we'll see that in a little bit. He has another situation kind of similar, and Abram explains that Sarah was the daughter of his father, but not the daughter of his mother, and that she became his wife. Now you're saying, well, that's weird or creepy, but in their culture, they saw the knittedness of siblings from a mother as being kind of what is really important to them together as far as being siblings. The father having different mothers is just kind of like, well, we get certain things from the father, and blessing or inheritance or so on and so forth, but it really didn't keep them from marrying one another. I know that sounds creepy, and that's kind of like, okay, well, that's weird, but that's what they believed. And it wasn't uncommon. In fact, if you remember a story of Amnon and Tamar, the son David, his son Amnon, and then Tamar, his daughter, they were from different mothers. And Amnon wanted Tamar, and she said, don't do this, because he was going to basically rape her. And he said, just ask, they'll give me to you, if you just tell them this is what you want. And so that was kind of a common thing. So Abram wants kind of Sarai to give a half-truth, kind of fudge on it a little bit, right? It's never a good start to any situation. So we move along, verse 14. So it was when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, and that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. And so, sure enough, Sarah, she was beautiful. I mean, I think she was probably in her late 60s or roughly around that time. So obviously she was a hottie, she was good looking, and for, no matter what age, she was obviously good looking. And they're like, wow, And it came to pass basically what happened, except this time, Abram sells her. I don't know how to put it. He sells her. And all the list of things that he received, he had sheep and oxen and stuff. That was basically what they gave him for her, right? And so can you imagine the situation? Imagine how Sarai felt. Not only did he tell her lie for me, right? Then he sells her, and basically she becomes part of Pharaoh's harem. Right? That's not a way to treat a daughter of God, right? Abram's not doing so well. And to make matters worse, Abram's getting rich. He's getting rich off of it. Listen, it doesn't matter. Sometimes we think the ends justify the means. Like, oh, well, look at the result, No, it's never good to lead by deception. And Abram's going to see this. Verse 17. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away and his wife and all that he had. So think about this. God defends not just Sarai, which he did, right? But he really is defending his plan. Because his plan is Abram and Sarai. They're going to bring forth the son, and then their son, and it's going to be a lineage that brings forth the Messiah. But not if there's a polluting of the lineage, and Sarai is defiled by Pharaoh. Now obviously nothing happened. It didn't happen, right? And it's interesting that Pharaoh understood. It doesn't say exactly how Pharaoh understood. Maybe Sarai said, I'm his wife, don't touch me, like what, and the plagues and stuff, and he realizes now there's something going on, right? And he rebukes Abram. Now listen, it's never a good situation when God's people have to be rebuked by the world. And that is never a good situation. Right? We're not doing something right if that's what ends up. Like the world's telling us, hey, that isn't really righteous. That's not really godly. Like, hello? Right? But listen, we see it. We see it happen in our world today, in the church today. Right? We see, maybe sometimes we think of like big names, like big name pastors who have no real accountability or act as though they're above rebuke. right? And because of that, they end up falling into some major sin or something, and now the world is the one calling them out. That should never be the case. Listen, it should be the case with us, no matter who we are in the body of Christ, right? We should always remain teachable. We should always remain open to reproof and open to rebuke. Proverbs 15:32 says, "He who disdains instruction despises his own soul, but he who heeds rebuke gets understanding." He gets wisdom. He becomes wise. So Abram, licking his wounds, right? He's leaving Egypt. He learns the hard way. So we move to chapter 13. Verse 1 says, "Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him to the south." Now to the south, that means that Abram went back up to the place where he should have been all along. He went back up to the promised land, back up to where God had called him. Now, I can only imagine that journey, that trip. It probably was very quiet, very cold, that journey, right? Probably Sarai didn't say a word to him, like, "I'm not talking to you until we get back to the promised land. You treated me like that, sell me into, I don't know." But Abram wised up, and God was gracious. He was gracious to Abram. Look at verse 2. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Think of that. He hadn't called on the name of the Lord since before, when he was in the promised land, and then he just left. So all that time, it basically was saying he hadn't called on the name of the Lord when he was down in Egypt and so on. Finally gets back to the promised land, wises up, and now he's calling on the name of the Lord. And you can see here in these verses, God is beginning to fulfill his promise, or fulfill that covenant with Abraham. He's blessing him. Look at all the livestock, silver and gold, right? And this is to a man who owns no land, right? God is blessing him. He is a wandering pilgrim going around. And so how is he being blessed? It's God. It's the sovereignty of God blessing Abram. He's back in the right place. He calls on the name of the Lord. Now, I talked about before, the decisions that we make oftentimes create worse, or kind of ramifications or consequences further down the line. Little compromises and those decisions, and if we don't fully seek the Lord on those things. And this is what we're going to see, especially in the case of Lot, right? God never told Abram to bring Lot with you, although Lot came with him, and he did allow him to come with him. So we're going to see an issue with Lot. Verse 5 says, "Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the Lord, the land, it says, was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And the Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land." I like that last phrase. "And the Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land." It's kind of like saying, the Canaanites and the Perizzites are looking at you, Abram, looking at you, Lot. They're watching you. They're looking at what's going on. You better do what's right. It's kind of an interesting situation, though. Lot has an abundance of livestock and so on. So that's kind of like a fulfillment, right? "I'll bless those who bless you." Lot was blessing Abram. God was blessing Lot, right? And so, but they get together, and they're all together in the land. The land could not sustain them. They're trying to stay together as one group, one family, one people. And they realize it's not working. A decision has to be made. But notice Abram's response. I love this. "So Abram said to Lot, 'Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, then I'll go to the left.'" I like that. Because basically this is the humility of Abram. Abram was the uncle. Abram was the elder. He was the older. He could have just said, hey, listen, Lot, you better crack down on your herdsmen. You better do what I tell you to do. I'm the elder here. I am the patriarch of this family unit. You need to just, cool your jets. You need to calm down. No, he didn't do that. In fact, he didn't say, you know what, I'm going to tell you where you can go. You go where I tell you to go, kind of a thing, right? He didn't do that either. Right? So this was Abram, though he was the elder, taking the lower seat. That's a good lesson to learn. We don't have to always push our weight around, our age, or whatever that might be, our title or position. We can take the lower seat. We can just say, you know what? That's fine. David did that. Didn't he do that? I mean, think about the situation David did with Absalom. David was willing to say, like, you know what? I'm going to leave. And people are like, why, David? Why? Because the Lord's in control. The Lord wants to bring me back. He'll bring me back. He'll take care of the situation. I'm just going to trust the Lord. I'm not going to try to pull the king card and, or my situation, pull the pastor card and, that kind of thing. No, we're just going to trust in the Lord, right? Trust in the Lord. And I do believe that Abram learned something while he was down in Egypt and that whole debacle right there. He learned, you know what? I should have learned, and I need to know now. I need to, put into practice now. I can trust the Lord. I can trust the Lord that no matter what he chooses, God's going to take care of me. God's going to provide for me. So I'm going to let Lot choose, and I'll just go wherever else. And so he does. Now, Lot shows himself to be really the opposite of Abram. Right? Let's look at how he chooses. Verse 10. And Lot lifted his eyes and saw the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. And this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go towards Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east. And they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. It says Lot lifted up his eyes. He lifted up his eyes, right? Lot serves as an example of looking at life with carnal or fleshly eyes, right? What did he do? He looked up, the plain of Jordan. Oh, it looks so good. Look at that ground. He's telling me, man, he doesn't know. I'm gonna pull one over on him. He's giving me that. He's letting me choose. I'm gonna take that. I see that. That's the place, right? And it's a plush, fertile land. He says it was like the garden of the Lord. Now, Lot never was in the Garden of Eden, but he's thinking that's what it must have looked like, right? The Garden of Eden. Look at it, And then he says, like Egypt. That wasn't a good thing. Now, obviously, there's the Nile Valley, right? It's green and plush, and a lot of produce is produced there, but it's Egypt, right? All he can think about is the eyes get big, and it's like, oh, this is going to be good, right? 1 John 2:16, it calls it the lust of the eyes, right? Oh, it looks good. Listen, it never bodes well for us to make decisions merely based on what things look like with our eyes. Or even for that matter, judging people with what we see with our eyes, as well as the circumstances. Didn't God tell Samuel, man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart.
Amen.
Right? God looks at the heart. Now, we don't know heart. We don't know people's hearts. We don't know what the deeper situation might be, but that means that it's incumbent upon us then to seek the Lord, right? To seek the Lord on what he desires in those matters, right? Otherwise, we're going to end up choosing with our eyes, right? Not a good move. So it tells us Lot moves all the way toward near Sodom. He pitches his tent. He's on the outside, but he's close to Sodom. He's getting closer. Listen, we're going to see as we move through this story, move through the rest of Genesis, Lot isn't near Sodom. Lot ends up in Sodom. In fact, Lot ends up at the gates, like the gate of a city is where the leaders of the city sit and do their, the council stuff, the making decisions for the city and whatnot. So Lot is actually in with the leadership. He is sucked in, right? He's just right there. But that's the nature of sin. Sin always takes you further than you ever thought you would go, right? It takes you further. It promises more than it gives, and it takes you further than you ever wanted to go. And in the end of verse 13, it's as if God was giving us a warning. He's saying basically, look, the people of Sodom, the men of Sodom were wicked, sinful. Stay away. Stay away. But Lot didn't do that. Verse 14. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look for the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. This is more an extension, if you will, of the Abrahamic covenant. God is promising to Abraham. And he's giving, I love this because as each time he talks about it, he's giving him more details. He's telling him more. Now he's saying, look at the land, north, south, east, west. It's going to be yours. I give it to you, right? I'm going to multiply your family, right? So not only everywhere you walk is it yours, but I'm going to multiply your family. It's going to be like the sands of the sea. Won't be able to count them, right? That's going to be you, Abram. And Abram was in his late 70s, approaching 80 years old. And he's probably thinking, well, I don't even have any kids yet. Like, how am I going to have these families? Well, we'll get to that, right? We'll get to that. So verse 18 says, then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. So again, he worships the Lord. That's a great response. Worships the Lord. It mentions Hebron. Now, I talked about this, I believe it was last week or the week before, and we talked about the genealogy of Shem, and there was a gentleman by the name of Eber. And I said, well, Eber is where some scholars believe they got the term or the name Hebrew from Eber. But there's also some who believe that they got the name Hebrew from Hebron. This is where and that makes sense too, right? But Hebron could have very well been named after Eber, right? So both as well could be true. And it's also believed... anyway, I was about to read something twice. Either way, it's cool because Abram's settling in, right? It's almost as if once Lot is gone, and Lot's going to come back again. Trust me, those problems don't go away easily. But it's as if he can now fully focus on the Lord. The distractions are out of the way. Now he can focus on the Lord. Now, we're going to jump into chapter 14. We got a lot to cover here. So, verse 1 says, and it came to pass, and there's a lot of names here, and I'm not very good with reading these names, so I'm going to just kind of do my best, but don't laugh. No, I'm just kidding. No, you can laugh, but no criticism. All right. It came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, and Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemaber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. So there's a group of kings, and there's another group of kings, and they're going to pit war against one another. And it kind of basically tells them in the valley of Siddim, or the Salt Sea, which is basically the area of the Dead Sea. Right? The Salt Sea is the Dead Sea. Verse 4 says, there 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked the Rephaim in Ashtaroth, Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Shava Kirathaim, and I told you I was going to be very good, and the Horites in the mountains of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who dwelt in Hazazon Tamar, and the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and joined together in battle in the valley of Siddim against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, king of nations. The same group of guys, right? And it says 4 kings against 5. So it's a pretty close matchup, right? 4 kings against 5. Obviously what you have here is these other kings, they were like vassal nations serving under Chedorlaomer, right? And after a dozen years or so, they're like, no more, not going to have it. And they rebel. And of course, that usually what happens is they're saying, no, you're mine, right? And we're going to come and attack you. And that's what's happening, right? There's this kind of regional war that's taking place with all these various kings and so on. Now, verse 10 says, now the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's son, our brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom. Now he's in Sodom. Here you go. And his goods, and departed. Now, again, he was near Sodom in a tent. Now he's living in Sodom. And, listen, it's a byproduct of living in the world, being a part of the world. You should be out of the world. When stuff happens, you're just in the middle of it, right? You're not going to, Lot shouldn't have been there in the first place, but he was. And when the war broke out, he's not going to get away from it. He's going to be, involved, or he's going to be affected by it, whether he's involved or not, whether he wants to be involved or not. Hosea 8:7 talks about sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. Right? Sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. See, Lot, he was sowing to the wind. He saw with his eyes, right? He didn't look with God's heart. He didn't ask God, what do you want me to do? Where should I go, right? He was just sowing the wind, right? He was looking with his eyes, and he got closer and closer and got moved in, even into the city, and now comes the whirlwind, right? And because it's a whirlwind, you can't, try to catch the wind and stop it. You're not going to stop it. It's just going to happen. Right? And he gets caught up in it. And that's a lesson for us, because it tells us that we should stay away from that worldliness. Don't get caught up in the mess, because as we do, it's just going to be like a whirlwind, a tornado, just tearing our lives apart. Verse 13 says, then one who had escaped came and told Abram, the Hebrew. That's the first time he's called a Hebrew. For he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and the brother of Aner, and there they were allies with Abram. Now when Abram heard that his brother, that's Lot, they're brothers in the sense that they're the same kin, right, was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his house, his own house, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. That's far to the north. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. So Lot hears about it, and he gets his guys together, right? And they go. Now it's interesting because, think about this. Lot could have said, you know what? Lot, Abram could have said, you know what? Lot made his choice. Let him stew. Let him get what he deserves, right? He made his choice. Hey, that's his problem, He should have thought about it a little bit better, right? Shouldn't have been in where, he shouldn't have been. No, Abram didn't do that because Lot was family. Lot was part of his family. I think oftentimes we're faced with bailing out a brother or a sister in Christ, and, maybe they've gotten into something that they shouldn't. Maybe they're in a situation because they've kind of were sowing to the wind, so to speak. They're playing with the world, and they're reaping now the whirlwind. And we could just as easily say, well, you know what? They're getting what they deserve, right? Let them, just suffer for a little while. That's not God's heart, right? Think about the book of Hosea. That is all about God coming after us. That's really symbolic of God being faithful to Israel, faithful to us, even when we're faithless. Even when we sow to the wind and reap the whirlwind, God comes back after us and brings us back to himself. In fact, Galatians 6:1 tells us, brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a, how? Berate him and tell him, you're a loser, you should have known better, I told you so. No, it says, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. There, but for the grace of God, go I. That's the attitude, right? See, God cares about all of us as his children. Even those who are struggling with an area of sin or whatever. Or maybe those that have shipwrecked their lives, shipwrecked their faith. God cares about them. So just like Abraham saved Lot and his family, we're to reach out to others in their time of the situation and have compassion on them, considering ourselves, because we could be in that same circumstance and situation, and we would want to have someone have compassion upon us. Verse 17, and the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, and that is the king's valley, and after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. Now, we're going to get back to that guy, right, in just a minute. We'll come back to the king of Sodom. But verse 18, you move on, and you're introduced to a pretty interesting character. Yes. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him, that's Abram, and said, blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he, Abram, gave him, Melchizedek, a tithe of all. Now, who is this guy Melchizedek? I know it's like a heavy loaded question, and we can have some good discussion afterwards, right? But his name means King of Righteousness, right? He is called the King of Salem or Jerusalem. Salem means peace, so he's the King of Righteousness and the King of Peace. And not only is he a king, it tells us that he's the priest of God Most High. Now, and it also tells us that he brings out bread and wine. Things that make you go, Now, there's been debate over the centuries of who is Melchizedek. Because there's not a whole lot about him other than these few verses. In the rest of the Old Testament, one other verse. Psalm 110, verse 4 says, the Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, obviously, that's a messianic term, right? That's a messianic prophecy speaking about Jesus. Yes. Now, so Melchizedek, who is he? Well, some say, there's one group of people that believe Melchizedek is what they call a theophanies or a Christophanies, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. Anytime God revealed himself to man in the Old Testament, that was Jesus, or at least a pre-incarnate version of Jesus, the second person of the Trinity appearing. So the burning bush was Jesus, right? When Joshua met the captain of the host of the Lord, that was Jesus, right? The angel of the Lord, when it appeared to people, capital A, that was a theophanies, or Jesus, Christophany. So they're all throughout. And this very well may be one of those moments, right? But even if he's not that, in the very least, and he is a huge, huge one of these as far as being a type of Christ, for sure, if anything, Melchizedek serves as a type of Christ. First off, Jesus was of the tribe of Judah, right? The priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, was of the tribe of Levi. And in fact, the high priests, they were from the lineage of Aaron. And so when the Jews, when they talk about Jesus, and the disciples of Christ talk about him being, the high priest, the ultimate high priest, they're like, we have a problem with that, because Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. He wasn't a Levite, nor was he of the lineage of Aaron. Right? So we got a problem. Well, not so, because God brings along Melchizedek, who preceded the Mosaic law, and he was both king and priest of God Most High. In fact, Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, is the only one of the other books that speaks mostly of Melchizedek, describes him as a type of Christ in the sense that he has no father, no mother, no beginning of days, no end of life, and so on and so forth. And so basically what they're saying is Jesus is in the same vein or in the same line as Melchizedek, as both king of righteousness as well as king of peace and a high priest. Now in verse 20 of our chapter, it tells us something else interesting. That Abram gave a tithe or a tenth to Melchizedek. Now understand, in that culture, the lesser always gave the tithes, or always gave the offering to the greater. Now think about that. Because basically Abraham is saying to Melchizedek, you are the greater. Now, that speaks volumes, because that means that's symbolic of the fact that Melchizedek's priesthood is superior then to the Aaronic priesthood. Why? Well, Aaron, he's not born yet, right? He's not coming for a while, but he is, the scriptures tell us, in the loins, if you will, or he's within the body of Abraham. He just hasn't been produced yet. So as in the body of Abraham, while Abraham is now submitting then to Melchizedek, it's basically showing us that the Melchizedek priesthood is superior to the Aaronic priesthood. It's very clear there in the symbolism and beyond. And so, again, you also have the symbolism of the bread and the wine that he brings, right? That's obviously the body and the blood of Christ. Now, let me finish with a few more verses, because we'll get done. It says, the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the persons and take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to the Lord God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from a thread to a sandal strap, and that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. Except only what the young men have eaten, and the portions of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. This is a great, one last lesson, right, from this text. Abram rightfully refuses to take anything from the king of Sodom. The king of Sodom was wicked, right? The men of Sodom were wicked. And Abram was a man centered on God's plan. And listen, he did not want God's plan to be polluted with the world's investment, with the world's involvement, right? He didn't want, when God blessed Abram, right, as he was getting blessed further and further along, He didn't want the king of Sodom to go, yeah, I helped in that. Yeah, I had something to do with that. Oh, really ultimately it was a part of what I gave him, like seed money, and this is why he's so blessed. No, Abram's like, no. You're not going to have anything to do with this work that God is doing in my life. Right? I'm not going to receive from you. That's so wise. Right? And so often we look at the end game and we think the ends justify the means, right? So, well, if these people, from this, bar or whatever want to give, and do whatever, we just go, well, but it's all for the glory of God. Well, no, not really. If they can have some claim to the glory and the credit, which the world will do, right? So we need to be careful of how we proceed. So 2 Corinthians 6:17 says, therefore come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you. So ultimately, this is God, or Abram, showing his heart to honor God, right? Now, we'll wrap it up. Next week, we're going to learn a lot more about Abram and soon to be Abraham. So let's go ahead and pray.